The US dollar is the most important currency for transactions between companies and between nations around the world.
King dollar does still dominate. You don't really have a choice there. You have to basically engage in US dollars if you want to participate in the kind of global financial system.
Not so for China's currency, the yuan or renminbi. You'll often hear those used interchangeably. It accounts for just a tiny fraction of global transactions. But China's President Xi Jinping is out to change that. He's pressing to make the yuan a rival to the dollar. I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, can the yuan knock King Dollar off its throne? As you might imagine, the answer to that question is complicated. Fortunately for us, Bloomberg's George Lay is here to break it down in plain language. George, one of the reasons why the U.S. is so important to the world economy is that the dollar is the most widely used currency in the world. Can you give us a picture of why the dollar is so important?
Basically, if we look at international transactions, international finance or international trade, the dollar accounts for roughly half of all the global trade flows. And if you count the euro, that's another 25%. So dollar and euro combined, they account for roughly 3/4 of all global transactions, whether it's person to person, whether it's between companies, and whether it's between state entities. So just to give you an example, if China wants to buy iron ore or other commodities from Brazil, the most common kind of transaction currency is the US dollar. And if someone based in Canada wants to wire money to Mexico, the intermediary currency is the US dollar. So it gives the United States a lot of advantage, but it also raises a lot of questions among people elsewhere, especially among people and among countries that are not in the US or in Europe. Back in April, when the president of Brazil visited Beijing, he asked a question: why should trades between China and Brazil be settled in the currency that is neither the Chinese yuan nor the Brazilian real?
Every night I ask myself, why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Why can we trade tied to our own currency? And why don't we have the commitment to innovate?
So a lot of countries want to circumvent the US dollar as a payment currency for various reasons, economic reasons as well as political reasons.
So why is the dollar, and to a certain extent the euro, why have they become the default currencies for so many international transactions?
A lot of it has to do with the history of the global economy and global trade, because traditionally, if we look at the past 30, 40 years, the US and European economies, they account for a big part of the global economy and a big part of the global trade. It is rapidly changing with China joining the picture. So China has been doing a lot of trades with other countries, non-US, non-European countries. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, it is because the US and Europe provide the most liquid financial markets when it comes to using these currencies. So if a country receives the US dollars, it can do a lot with these dollars. It could invest in US Treasury markets, it could invest in US stock market, and it could invest the money in the US in terms of foreign direct investments, factories, and other stuff. The same rule applies in Europe. But it is not really the case in China. China still has capital controls. So if you want to invest in Chinese bonds, if you want to invest in Chinese stock markets, there are a lot more bureaucratic controls than in US and Europe. So that also explains why countries would prefer to be paid in the US dollar and the euro instead of the Chinese yuan or the Brazilian real or the Indian rupee.
But now you report that China is becoming more assertive in wanting to make yuan's currency a currency that plays in international markets much more.
Yes, that's exactly the case, especially after the war in Ukraine, because the leadership in Beijing witnessed the sanctions both by the US and by Europe piled upon Russia, and they realized that conducting transactions in the US and Euro might not be a safe choice. They really want to have some alternative just in case similar sanctions were imposed on China.
And this is also part of the general growing rivalry between the U.S. and China, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So, as you mentioned, there's this ongoing geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and China, and Beijing wants to have alternatives to everything that so far has been U.S.-dominated. Beijing is trying to get companies to list it in Hong Kong, which they think it's a safer choice as a financial center than New York. Beijing is trying to push for domestically produced computer chips, and at the same time, Beijing is also trying to make sure that transactions, especially commodities transactions that are vital to China's economy, that are vital to China's national security, can be more or less settled in China's own currency instead of relying on the US dollar or the euro.
So you can see why China would want to do this, but what is the appeal to other nations to adopt China's currency instead of continuing to do transactions in the dollar or the euro?
I think first it's the diversification benefits. Let's take Russia, for example. Before the war in Ukraine, China and Russia has also been pushing for the use of the Chinese renminbi, but with very limited success.
But Russia plans to cut dollar holdings in wealth fund to zero.
After the war, the renminbi payments and renminbi transactions in Russia has really taken off. The Chinese yuan has replaced both the US and the euro as the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange. So Russia might be a more extreme case because the country has been cut off from both US and euro funding, so it has to rely on the Chinese yuan. But it also serves as an example to other countries. They see that using the Chinese yuan could be a success in the case of Russia. With the yuan, Russia could continue to export its oil to Beijing, and with the Chinese yuan, it could import a lot of goods which were produced by China. So we're not talking about the Chinese yuan replacing the US dollar or the euro. Actually, in the medium term, if we look at the next 5 to 10 years, very few people are forecasting the Chinese yuan surpassing the dollar or euro as the most important currency of international trade. But the yuan could provide some diversification benefits, and other countries could look at the geopolitical picture and say, hey, I don't want to put all my eggs in the dollar and in the euro. I could continue to be using the dollar, using the euro, but we could make 5% or 10% of our trades in Chinese yuan terms.
You mentioned specifically how Russia has been adopting China's currency for that reason, to circumvent these sanctions. Is this a way that countries that are seeking to get around U.S. sanctions are increasingly using, just simply to avoid the dollar altogether?
I think it's still too early to tell, because if you look at the countries that are subject to a lot of U.S. sanctions, what we're talking about is Russia, Iran, North Korea. I think these are the most prominent examples. Russia is the country with the biggest economic size among all these we've talked about. Russia has $1 trillion economy, and Russia has a lot of business to do with China, and Russia has really a big consumer base. It's a country with a population of more than 100 million people. And also Russia is cut off from the euro system as well, where Iran's oil exports can still be priced and executed in euros. So we're really talking about an experimental case of a big country, $1 trillion economy with more than 100 million people, that at this point they were forced off the euro system and forced off the dollar system. But if it succeeds, China could just really take Russia as an example and go to other countries that are under US sanctions or that are not really on friendly terms with the US and say, hey, this could really work. Why don't you consider using my currency as well?
And can you explain how Russia using yuan would enable it to get around U.S. sanctions. How does that actually work?
Because now let's take oil exports, for example. Russia is not allowed to export oil to the U.S. It's not allowed to export oil to the European Union, but it is still permitted to export oil elsewhere. And still, Russia exports oil to China and India. Let's say if they take their payments in the US dollar or in the euro, it is very difficult for Russia to dispose of these currencies because there are many restrictions on where Russia could deposit its FX reserves, how Russia can use it, and what kind of products Russia can buy. But if a Russian entity still holds US dollars and euros and still make transactions in US dollars and euros, it is subject to a lot of restrictions. But if it holds the Chinese yuan, it is subject to practically no restrictions. Of course, if you're holding the Chinese yuan, there are certain goods that you cannot buy. It's difficult for you to take the yuan and say, hey, I want to buy a BMW or I want to buy some US products. But they could buy a lot of stuff that are produced by China or by countries that are not part of the euro or the US dollar system. Say, they could buy Brazilian soy, they could buy Argentinian wheat. And now most of these transactions were still done in the US dollar and euro. But if the yuan system becomes successful, they could take the yuan and go to South America to buy a lot of food stuff. They could take the yuan to China to buy cars, to buy machinery, to buy drones, for example. A lot of the civilian use drones were exported by Chinese companies. So they could, in a sense, replace a lot of its merchandise needs that are currently supplied by the US and by European countries.
After the break, China's currency slowly starts to work its way in.
Argentina will use the yuan for trade with China, and they'll start this month.
The Chinese national oil company completing its first LNG trade with France's Total Energy using the Chinese yuan.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
George, you mentioned Brazil as one country that's starting to question why everything is done in dollars, in euros, and are looking at China's currency as an alternative. What are some other countries that are doing the same?
Argentina, for instance. Argentina has a FX swap line with China, which means the Argentine central bank could access the Chinese yuan if it needs. There's a quota on it, but they could access a few billions of dollars worth of the Chinese yuan. They are recently tapping that swap line. Brazil, as we mentioned, and back in March, China and Saudi Arabia signed a deal in which a Chinese state bank lent money to Saudi Arabia in Chinese renminbi terms. There are increasingly more Western companies also using Chinese yuan as a settlement currency. In March, the French energy company Total Energy, they signed a deal with China's National Offshore Oil Corporation to settle a natural gas trade in the Chinese renminbi. And over the past couple of years, Australian miners, including BHP, including Rio Tinto, they have signed contracts with various Chinese state companies to settle iron ore trades in the Chinese yuan. I think it's really symbolic in terms of China really pushing to have these transactions with companies based in developed countries, let's say a French company or BHP in Australia. There's still a lot of hurdles for China to try to make yuan sort of the default currency or try to make the yuan a major part of the transaction. Because now, if you're doing business with France or Australia, probably 99% of the transactions wouldn't be settled in the Chinese yuan. But at the same time, China is a major customer. China is one of the biggest buyers of natural gas, of oil, of iron ore. So it does have some leverage. I think now people realize it is a major policy imperative from high up that China wants to get the renminbi to play a bigger role in terms of trade, in terms of settlements, especially in commodities trades. So Chinese state companies, which are the major buyers of these commodities, would really make the push to say, hey, if I do business with you, I want a certain percentage of the deals settled in the Chinese yuan, whether you're a French company, an Australian company, or a Brazilian company. And I think these companies, the sellers, do have an incentive to satisfy the demands of the buyers, in a sense, to satisfy the demands of your client. So China could really make the push to have a certain amount, let's say 1% or 2% of the total trade volume settled in yuan. But once you want to push further, once you want to do, let's say, 5% or 10%, and these companies with the Chinese yuan, they still have limited access to Chinese markets, to Chinese stocks, to Chinese bonds. So they might need to make further reforms in their market, so that for companies having tens of billions of dollars worth of yuan, they need to find somewhere to invest, and China need to make its markets attractive to these investments.
If other developed countries start seeing more of these deals taking place, do you think that will lead to an increase in the willingness of other companies, other countries, to take a look at this currency, even though it's not fully convertible?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Other companies and other countries would absolutely be looking at this, and they would be thinking about this as an alternative, because if things go right, Chinese yuan has the potential to become the third widely used currency in terms of global trade and global finance.
Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think that China's currency will become the third major currency in the world at some point?
I think if they play the cards right, if they proceed with the same sense of urgency, and at the same time they really need to continue to make reform to their financial market, to their financial system over the next 5 to 10 years, it's quite possible for the Chinese yuan to become the third most used currency in global trade and global finance, exceeding all the other non-dollar, non-euro currencies that we're talking about: Canadian dollar, Japanese yen, British pound. The bar for them to get close to or even replace the dollar and euro, it is extremely high. And also we need to consider the scenario, because now the US and Europe isn't really pushing back on any kind of the yuan settlement projects or yuan settlement deals. So now the Chinese yuan is roughly somewhere between 1% and 2% of global trade and global finance, global settlements. So once we reach a level of 5% or even 10%, I'm pretty sure there is going to be a strong response from US and Europe saying that we got to stop this, because this is really threatening the role of the dollar and, to a lesser extent, euro in terms of the global financial ecosystem.
George, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Wes.
When we come back, how China's currency push fits into the nation's larger global ambitions. What we're talking about today is part of a larger effort by Xi Jinping to increase China's stature in global affairs, and of course his own as well. Bloomberg reporter Rebecca Chung-Wilkins is back with us again today to tell us all about that. Rebecca, China has become more ambitious on the world stage. We see Xi Jinping taking a bigger stance on international affairs, and now we see this move to make China's currency sort of a bigger player in international deals. How are those two things tied together?
For China, the internationalization of its currency has always been a critical part of kind of establishing it on the world stage and, crucially, establishing an alternative to the US. And of course, we know the dollar has this extraordinary and unique dominance when it comes to the global currency and what currency folks use. But over the last decade, we've seen Beijing trying to make that push. And particularly, for example, when we look at trade deals, policymakers in China often trying to incorporate or include some element of trade settlements in the UN as part of those deals. There has been some momentum already. However, it really is Russia's war in Ukraine and that sweeping set of sanctions that has seen the acceleration of yuan's use and actually has done far more than any policymaker in Beijing has ever been able to do to make it more commonly used in the world.
Which countries in particular have begun to take advantage of this new arrangement, especially when the dollar now has become off limits to certain countries because of sanctions?
Well, if we think sort of purely in geopolitical terms, countries as they're positioned somewhere between an allegiance or a leaning towards the US versus China. And what we tend to see is countries that may have an inclination towards leading either as full formal partners of China or perhaps just more inclined. They tend to be much more interested. So, for example, we've seen recent deals by Middle Eastern countries. We tend to see more attention and more enthusiasm for these types of countries that we may see also that China has made much more an effort to engage with, typically countries that are sometimes called the Global South. What's surprising, though, is increasingly as the yuan has become more popular, we have seen even, for example, France, one of its companies, choosing to settle a trade deal in the yuan as well.
What do you foresee? How long do you think before the yuan winds up becoming a significant currency that competes with the dollar, that competes with the euro for transactions all over the place?
I've asked a lot of traders what they think about this, and the answer I always get is it depends. And I get answers that go anywhere between 10 years and 100 or 200 years. And I think the factor that really affects that is geopolitical. Whether we see this urgent need to create an alternative. And when we look at, for example, how important Russia's war in Ukraine has been to kind of pushing momentum for the use of the yuan, you can see these type of events can be critical in changing that balance. The percentage is very, very small so far. But if you have these sort of big geopolitical events, they can totally change the balance. And relatively quickly, we're talking about a year, essentially, of sanctions. The one big question, of course, is whether and how far the economic statecraft agenda goes when it comes to the US and its allies. How far are the US and allies going to go when it comes to containing China, as it would call it, and trying to curb China's influence in the world? The more it does so, the more incentive there is for China in particular to really drive home that agenda. And of course, all the countries around it that want to continue doing trade with it. I think the way China sees it is not necessarily a bipolar system, but a multipolar system, where countries have much more autonomy and essentially, as they see it, are not under the thumb of the US. So there is this alternative to pit, and there's a real alternative to pit. Of course, that point, King Dollar does still dominate. You don't really have a choice there. You have to basically engage in US dollars if you want to participate in the kind of global financial system. It's really that shift in balance that they want, not necessarily ultimately to be picking between one and the other. And I would imagine also there is some element in which ultimately there would be a desire for this to be more neutral. You know, these sort of issues now have become politicized in a way that they haven't been in the past. And I suppose ultimately there perhaps would be this desire for Chinese policymakers for the use of the yuan to not be seen, in fact, as a way of a mechanism of picking sides, but simply as a mechanism of doing business in a world in which China is much more powerful.
I suppose in order for that to happen, it would require the US, it would require EU countries to accept the yuan as another currency. It couldn't just go one way, and we haven't seen much evidence of that happening.
No, and that again speaks to the sort of very small percentage of use by the yuan so far internationally. Although we have seen these sort of sporadic deals, I mentioned, for example, a French deal, it's still very, very small. Given the kind of context of US-China relations, we're a ways away before seeing anything like that from the US. But even some of its allies and its partners have been relatively slow to engage in this too.
What would the economic effects for the US, for the EU be if the yuan started to encroach on the dollar's dominance and even the dominance of the euro?
It's a really hard question to answer, I think, because so much of that would depend on the pace and the scale and the reason why we saw that coming in. If it was introduced in the context of some kind of sanctions, for example, being leveraged on China and this really urgent desire to push an alternative that actually can function very quickly at the scale that China would need it to, that, of course, would be much more challenging to the US. But if we're talking about something that's a much more gradual process and that's accompanied by some kind of rapprochement in kind of geopolitical tensions too, we wouldn't necessarily see that happening. And in fact, some element of diversification, some element that kind of reduces the reliance on the dollar, also is potentially good for other developing nations. You know, the whole point about having diversity is essentially not to be so vulnerable when the dollar moves and so on. And so there is also an argument to be made that a somewhat more diverse global settlement currency could actually help create a bit more stability in some of those emerging markets too.
So, Rebecca, this is obviously something that a lot of people are just keeping an eye on to see how it unfolds. As somebody who's covering this, what are you watching for?
I'm really watching to see whether the US or some of its closer allies start to be a little bit uncomfortable, start to feel like this is getting a little too close for comfort, too many deals are being done. We don't really want to allow this happening at a moment when tensions between China and the US are so taut. So when you think about the G7 nations who recently met versus China and Russia and these alternative two world orders, we do see this sort of polarization. We do see this divergence. And that inherently does mean that what currency you choose is a political decision because of the world that we're in now. So I'm personally interested to see whether we see more of this dialogue enter into geopolitical discussions.
Rebecca, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Federica Romaniello is our producer. Our associate producer is Zenab Siddiqui. Raphael Amsili is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.